recording now. Hi, folks. We're just giving a few moments here at the top for Zoom to let everybody in before we get started with tonight's event. Thank y'all for being here tonight. If you are already in tonight's webinar with us, feel free to open up your chat window. Let us know where you're zooming in from, and you can also find some information about how to purchase tonight's featured book in the chat. Good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Chelsea from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Major Jackson presenting his new book, A Beat Beyond. He'll be talking with Amor Kohli, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thank you to Major, Amor, and the team at University of Michigan Press for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make this space for conversation and connection. Now, just a couple of housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they cannot see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple of different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. That's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And importantly, tonight's featured book, A Beat Beyond, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person or online, where you can purchase Major's book and many others on site. As thanks for attending tonight's virtual event, we're offering 10% off the featured book. Enter coupon code GreenlightEvents10 into the coupon discount section at checkout online for 10% off. Our interviewer tonight is Amor Kohli. Coley is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of African and Black Diaspora Studies at DePaul University. His publications include essays on Black writers published in the journals Callaloo, African Identities, and Journal of Commonwealth Literature, and a number of edited collections. He is also editor of A Beat Beyond, tonight's featured book. He'll be speaking with our featured author, Major Jackson. Jackson is the author of 5 books of poetry, including The Absurd Man, Roll Deep, Holding Company, Hoops, and Leaving Saturn, which won the Cave Canon Poetry Prize for a first book of poems. Major Jackson lives in Nashville, Tennessee, where he is the Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Chair in the Humanities at Vanderbilt University. He serves as the poetry editor of the Harvard Review. In his new book, A Beat Beyond, Jackson revels in the work of poetry, not only to limn and assess the intellectual and spiritual dimensions of poets, but to amplify the controversies and inner conflicts that define our age. Political unrest, climate crises, the fallout from bewildering traumas, and the social function of the art of poetry itself. Major is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then he'll be talking with Amor and with all of you. Major, please take it away. See, Major, I think you're muted still.
There we go. Thank you, Chelsea. And what an honor to read under the auspices of Greenlight Bookstore. And thank you for the good people who are in attendance. Thank you for tuning in. And obviously, I want to thank my collaborator, Amor Coley, for undertaking this gargantuan task. And I'm going to just give you a short description of the book and then read the first essay, not the entire. I've cut it down for this occasion. But let me say, first and foremost, I want to also thank all of the editors who kind of solicited essays from me to write about the art, but also to my students for whom I have discussed ad nauseum a good deal of what I'm about to say right now. What was wonderful about putting this together was that it allowed me to kind of distillate some of what I strongly believe poetry to do and its place in our world and in our culture, and personally in my own on my own journey. So thanks to those editors, thanks to you. Those editors are American Poetry Review, Academy of American Poets, Poetry Foundation. So the BPN is a collection of talks, ephemera pieces, reviews, introductory remarks for edited volumes of poetry that I put together, many of which, all of those assignments help to crystallize and for me to get a hold, at least temporary, on the art of poetry as a practice, one I believe that has immense social and political valence. The writings range from just plain downright silliness to attempts to engage critical conversations that set fire to my thinking about poetry. This book is published under the auspices of University of Michigan's Poets on Poetry series, which I can say as a autodidact probably accounts for about a quarter of my education. To that end, like all pieces of writing, each one of these blog posts, lectures, each one of them began as a kind of performance, but then quickly became personally instructive, and in some instances, instigative in a way, in Ars Poetica sets an agenda for one's future works. Here's a piece that began as a lecture at Bennington College, I'm going to say either 2007, 2008, but was then republished about 11 years later, crazy enough, in an anthology put together by the good people at Furious Flower down at James Madison University. It's called My Lyrical Self. One, in his Nobel lecture on December 12, 1975, the Italian poet Eugenio Montale announced that the true material of poetry is sound. I doubt if Montale ever read the American poet Amiri Baraka, but nonetheless, his words echo for me Baraka's contribution to Donald Allen's landmark anthology, The New American Poetry, in which Baraka argues, quote, the only recognizable tradition a poet need follow is himself. And with that, say all those things out of tradition he can use, adapt, work over into something for himself to broaden his own voice with. You have to start and finish there, your own voice, how you sound. Baraka refutes T.S. Eliot's near neurotic urging in tradition and the individual talent that poets, in their quest to become great poets, give up that which is unique and central to poetry, at least for the moment, the impression of the human soul, experience, and will. Eliot famously remarks in one of those cone-like statements that has come to define a whole approach to writing that on the surface feels spiritually driven. The progress of an artist is a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality. Although I have taken heed to Eliot's warning, urging that a developing poet must possess a healthy absorption of the past, a tradition, and not one to be accused of suffering from saline consciousness, I have allowed myself the pleasure of being heavily influenced by reading great poets over time and geographies. Li Bai, Sappho, Miguel Hernandez, Gwendolyn Brooks, Nicholas Guillen, Yanis Ritsos, many others. And yet, I have often wondered about the source of Eliot's phobia against the individual self as expressed in a personality. In opposition, I have asked my students, just as I've asked myself, many times while composing, where in the poem are you most represented? For what I want most to encounter is, I don't say it in the book, but a personality, a human voice, an authentic self expressed not only in the movement of thought on the page, but also in the moments of figuration, image making, and the syntactical arrangement of words into linguistic phrases, tones, and silence, for it is there that great emotion resides. I follow up my query with, quote, how have you trained your ear to create subtle meanings in the poem's rhythm, caesura, and how has this worked to imprint your voice onto the page? For me, paying attention to the poem's syntax also means looking at the rhythmic surge of language, surely, but also the architecture of sentences and how, as Robert Frost phrased it, a speaking voice and personality are, quote, fastened to the page for the ear of the imagination. Once I heard a distinguished poet remark about a poet unfamiliar to him, whom he had just met and heard, give a reading from his work for the first time. It happened on a beautiful spring afternoon. With immense wonder, he said, my God, that man is at the center of language. He is at the center of the song. The elder poet did not make clear what he meant by the song or what it meant for a poet to be at the center of language, but those of us sitting in the hotel lounge awaiting the dinner hour instinctively knew. And we also knew that this was the highest praise one poet could grant another. We understood that to enter language was the equivalent of Elizabeth Catlett entering wood-carved sculptures, or Thelonious Monk entering silence at the piano and in life, a kind of mastery and contribution that is at once a part of and distinct from whatever came beforehand. The poet is the historian and keeper of his art, but he is also the iconoclast who challenges and reshapes its capacity to represent human experience from the inside out. What the elder poet was praising was the younger poet's freedom and ability to slip the constraints of poetry. To write from the center of language also gets at it. More succinctly, Eliot's urging to hear the song, which is the accumulated noise that is hammered into artful speech. All those poems, epic stories, sermons, myths, and other works of art that construct the comprehensive portrait of humankind. Our aim as writers is to not only hear the past, but to contribute to that song by activating and regenerating language that is reflective of our freedom. All the poems ever written are attempts to add one's own sound to that collective cry of humanity. This is what is meant by high lyric. All else is fiddling and gimmickry, a kind of muttering that aspires to pure song, but lacks the reach and richness of its intents and contours. As a poet, I want my best poems to push forward into the inner workings of language, to exploit both its suggestive and literal meanings, but also to set ringing language's physical properties, to reach the transcendent condition of an art to which I utterly give myself. In so doing, I employ the full range of possibilities, both conventional and experimental, by which to dramatize my life into song and what I call the lyric self. In short, I am less interested in uttering something profound or lasting, but merely want to announce my freedom, presence, and ephemerality. It has been my experience that one's melodic self is amplified in the face of formal constraints. For poets, such decisions as writing in form or rhyme or constructing some syllabic count to which each line adheres, paradoxically get us closer to a unique voice, a sound forged out of a pressurized moment, such that what lingers is the instant and mark of a selfhood in time. Think of a trumpeter or percussionist soloing against the constraints of a tune whose melody is well known. Still, she must somehow inscribe her own version and interpretation. Simply listen when you have free time to Ella Fitzgerald's Moonlight in Vermont, and then compare it to Willie Nelson's version. In both instances, what you hear is how style is a glorious statement of freedom against constraints. The trope of poets singing their lives, making a sound, is as old as poetry itself. From Sappho to Bob Dylan, and from Archelikos to Jay-Z, poets have given expression to lost loves, erotic yearning, the birth of a daughter, the guilt at eating someone else's fruit in the refrigerator, the death of a dear friend, the unexplained jealousy of a younger sibling, and just about every other aspect of the human journey that we all share. So, Amor, do you mind if I start off by asking, well, first, again, thank you for editing this volume. And I want to ask a question before you launch into a bunch of questions. What was it like for you to edit Beyond? Was there any particular highlights or any particular challenges you want to share with me publicly now that we are here?
Sure. I mean, thank you. And thanks for reading. And let me first take a second to thank Greenlight Bookstore and their staff for all the work putting this event together. And also, I think, I want to, because they made it so smooth for us, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the great support we received from the University of Michigan Press and their editorial and marketing teams. I mean, it was a really, really pleasurable experience, which I was not expecting sometimes. And then I thank you for being here. And honestly, first, I just also will say that I just want to express my thanks to you for entrusting me with your work. Right? I mean, that's not a small thing for sure. And I feel honored and privileged to have been part of this, because I know how much trust is involved in that, in giving this work over for someone else to pick at and to move around and to do all this stuff. So it's a great experience. I'm looking forward to upcoming collaborations. And then back to to your question. One of the challenges, of course, was that we had a word count limit, and there was a lot that we had to figure out. I had to figure out like what would work, what wouldn't work, and so I know that there were some great pieces that were left on the cutting room floor, so to speak. So you get past that, but that was something that was a bit of a challenge, just trying to figure out which ones to put in. But one of the best parts about this was that we decided not to go in a chronological or linear, chronological order to the essays that suggests a kind of linear development, which we know is not the case, right? This is not linear. This kind of development is not linear at all. And I think that was really one of the highlights, right? And the challenge at the same time, figuring out how to sequence these pieces where they could actually provide people with a sense of your development as a thinker, as an artist, as a writer, and in a way that was true to it, but also didn't do the sort of, A went to B, B went to C, and then, and then we were done. It was also just great to revisit your work, which, I'd seen pieces here and there, of course, and followed along, but just to be able to really immerse myself in this, and to come at it from a different point of view than, say in a scholarly article or something. So I think that, that was really, it was really exciting for me to see that, right? Because just try, and I felt like I was part of that process, right? In
Mhm.
this case, we were creating something, and something that I think has turned out really well. And I know I had to pull a little bit out of you to put in some of those older pieces,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Because we don't, we don't like to look at our young work sometimes, because we shake our heads and say, "Damn, how did I let that go?" Um, but to me,
well, it's interesting if you don't mind me following
oh
up
no,
on
no,
that.
go.
That's probably what I'm most grateful for, because when I read those older pieces, particularly the pieces that are me kind of trying to elbow my way into a conversation that is as well covered as ours, poetry and its defenses as well as its explications are out there, and I hear the language of a 20-something-year-old who doesn't fully like grasp the full dimensions of it, and there's a level of wincing and embarrassment. But you were adamant about that being in there. There was something about the idioms of the 90s and 2000s also that I had to contend with. I mean, I was a hip hop head who was under the influence of Greg Tate, Bell Hooks, Cornel West, and you know, um, and not that the ideas don't hold up, it's just the language, and that's where I'm going back to. It's like I can hear a period of which there's so much distance. You also were more familiar with my poetry. In fact, you were one of the first people, thank you, to give a critical look at my work. So I wasn't sure if you were familiar with the occasional kind of, I can't even call them criticisms, I would just say book reviews and blog posts, and there's the introduction to the County Cullen volume, which is more literary history than literary criticism. But
Yeah, I mean, I definitely was, and I was not keeping up on the blog posts and all
right,
of that.
right.
So but it was good to get.
As
But
you should not.
yeah, I got work to do, Major. I got work to
Yeah.
do. um, but yeah, I think that I'm really pleased with the way it came together, and just provides this insight into that moment, right? Into that moment of the 90s, particularly with what is happening in terms of hip hop, but also poetry scenes, and sort of young Black writers coming. Really, I mean, so many of whom are now just at the top of their fields, top of their games. Just to get a little bit of a insight back into that. But I do have questions for
Sure.
you as well. I mean, and they're somewhat broader questions, because the book covers your career, and it goes in all these different directions that are still linked. But so I guess I'll flip the question to you, and I'm just wondering, after seeing, you already started to talk about this a little bit, but well, first, as you mentioned, it's part of a series called Poets on Poetry, right? And so the process as well as the product of poetry is what is central to what you write about in the book. And so looking back, I'm wondering now, did you learn anything other than a little bit like wincing and embarrassment? Did you learn anything about yourself or your body of work after reading these pieces, whether in this order or just pieces that you may not have thought about for some time?
Yeah. Two things I can answer on that score. One of them, going back to the 90s and 2000s, when performance poetry, slam poetry, the poetry of hip hop, whereby the artists that you and I kind of bonded over, I remember some of our conversations, those particular rappers saw themselves in a tradition of a Black literary enterprise.
Right.
And as a result, we did too. Like, there wasn't too much of a kind of like poetry as high art. It was part of the people. And so I think it was good to kind of see that emerge again, to think about how I have been influenced by music writ large, but not in any, clearly I'm not a hip hop poet. You could just read my last. There are some early moments in the first 2 or 3 books where you can hear the kind of rhythmic patterning and rhyme usage where that's the case. So that was interesting to kind of see that delineated. The other thing is, I did not realize the extent to which, almost in a pleading kind of fashion, I was making a case for poetry as a form of writing ourselves towards a greater sense of ourselves. Or if I have to contend with, for example, racialized violence, state-sanctioned violence, it's on the page where I can most express my individual self against any outside construction. And so the body of work, the poems, in Whitmanian fashion really do become a place in which I get to understand who I am, and to I say hammer a self into being. I'm thinking about what it means to write within inherited forms, or to try to create a sense of self in forms that have not been explored before. And that's where freedom comes in. Freedom to experiment, to imagine, to push up against, to borrow. All of that is connected. Those, I guess, in prose, I realized that I was making that argument over and over again.
Yeah, I can absolutely see that. I can see throughout your privileging of expression and your drawing that you're drawn to artists, writers, rappers, whatever, right? Who privilege and revel in expression and all the playfulness and power that can go into that. And one can really see that tracing through your prose work as well as your poetry. So you talked about in this case about finding yourself through writing yourself through poetry, understanding who you are, hammer self into being, right? But of course, your work and your approach is not only you, right? There are others involved, and one of the things that's always struck me about your poetry and your prose is how much you bring in discussion and mentions of influence and influences, right?
It's embarrassing.
I mean, but of all different, right? We've got an essay called "Poetry and the Influence of a Non-Literary Variety," in the piece on of Tales of the Heroic, right, on Weaver, right? You write about, really pretty movingly, I think, about being a child at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, right, and what you encountered as well. And so, and in convergences and confluences, right, we get a rolling catalog of all of these influences. So of course, and I know you weren't saying this, right, it's not just you, right, it's you within a legacy, a tradition of other artworks, of other artists, of other people, but whether they're family members, neighborhood folk, whatever it is. So I'm really interested then about your relationship to influences. And I hate to break it to you, right? But you are now a senior member of the. I'm right there with you. And so I guess to really bring it into a question here is like, what do you get from your influences, and then what do you hope others get from your influence, right? Because we hope that young writers or young readers of poetry or of literature in general will look at this book and get something like that out of it. So I'm wondering how you think about the influences now, and then the influence that you can provide to others.
Yeah, well, that question must first be contextualized in the sense that reading in a very real way saved me. So first and foremost, influence was more like, here were these kind of saints in a lot of ways. Here were these angelic voices that entered my life, and it was cool to meet other people who also shared a passion for Giannis Ritsos or Nicholas Guillen, Gwendolyn Brooks. And I say cool, what I guess what I mean by that is you realize that these voices first come to you as voices or poems that you needed to hear, and that others, you realize others needed to hear too. So there's something kind of sacred about the estate of poetry. It's spiritual in the most profound ways, actually. Someone who you've never met across time and maybe geography and faith and race has uttered something that resonates inside the body. So there's that. And so my reading led to me at some point deciding I want to also be a writer. And reading shifted. Reading was less of pleasure and more kind of, I want to figure out how that power is enacted. And I built my friendships around people who shared that same quest, that same faith and belief in literature. So the essays allowed me to do several things. One, to kind of go in, the critics call it close reading. For me, it was close reading, close listening, close seeing, tasting. I mean, like, really getting into, and that's what I love about that utterance by that poet. Like, to go to the center of language is to have a different relationship to the canon. It is, here's the material, and at some point you need to kind of get inside it so that you can be at one with it. And the song is the collective readings and myths and stories that we have encountered. Influence, of course, is people who have journeyed to that center, and they just open a path to you. So that's my teaching emerges out of that. And tradition, influence and tradition go together. I mean, Elliot hit it there, but the tradition that we construct is a very personal thing too. Like, I have friends, I won't mention the poet, who loves this particular poet. It hasn't reached me yet. I can't see that path that they laid out. So thank you for realizing that pattern. The writing eventually became also, the essays in here are also moments of advocacy. There's certain poets in here, like Meme Brusenberger, for example, Frank Bedard, of course, she doesn't need advocacy, Tracy K. Smith. Poets in here who I was happy to write about because it became a moment for me to say, here is the virtues of a poetry that its speed of association, its registers of language serve us in these ways as both readers, and if you are a writer, as a writer. So influence is hugely important, and as a teacher, as a practitioner as well, that's maybe a fourth of my work, is to get students or get friends to treasure these voices, exalt them, hold them up, learn from them.
So it sounds, I mean, and I certainly have seen this in your work, right? This sort of empathetic impulse that is there is also something that you're trying, I think, to train others in, right? So I mean, at one point you talk about relatability and how, right, people are saying, well, I can't relate to this. And that's the work, right? The work of entering into the consciousness of another, right? And again, what Baldwin talked about is communion, right? Right, communing together through literature, through the reading, through the talking, or through just the silent sharing, right? Whatever messages we're transmitting around about when we celebrate the joy and the joy of the work, right? And hopefully enter into, and I think your work does this, and there are many others whom I read, who I can see this. Like you can see the writer, the poet reveling in the work, right, in the process. And when that can jump off the page, I think, and I think it does in your poetry and in this prose as well. When you can do that, it's and I'm, not to be too, grandiose here, right? But it is a gift. It is a gift.
Yeah.
And go
Yeah.
ahead.
No, I was just thinking
Yeah.
about revelation and the revelry when we experience revelation in poetry or prose or art itself, almost turns us in a way to, in a way, small way, to kind of proselytizers. I don't mean as poets, I mean as readers, when we encounter something that reaches us at that level. You're mentioning the empathy and the dismissal, like, is really, that one hits really home for me, because I have this other innate belief that literature cultivates a possibility for us to hear each other, particularly across all the kind of constructions that we put around people. Something about the lyric voice strips away, not to say that identity is not important in the reading or hearing, but something about the purity of a poem or of language in artful use kind of conditions us, I think, to hear each other in ways that we wouldn't hear, let's say, during political seasons, or the language around anything that kind of separates us.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that question, because I feel like that's a bigger question that's going to take us somewhere. But I want to just rewind just a little bit. We didn't use this word, but it made me when you were talking, it made me think of a little while ago we had a discussion about contemplation. Right. And I think it was because of your out of office email. I don't know if you remember this, right? Where it was the first time I ever saw one that, that stated, hey, I'm going to be thinking about things, going to take some time to think, going to do my Walden Pond thing.
Walden Pond.
Right. Exactly. And I was like, oh, of course. Right. That's what we do in those moments, or we're supposed to do. But it's almost, I think, something like hit me. I was like, oh, I've never seen that before in an email, right? In a professional email. But of course it makes,
I'm a poet.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it makes perfect sense. And you had said something about, right? Because I think we're in a moment where we're wondering, where empathy went. But before we get to that part, I want to think about contemplation, because I think that is another thing that perhaps we've lost or downplayed, or, so I want to just get a little bit more about your process and thinking about contemplation, I guess, but thinking about that and what that means to you as an artist, as a teacher, as a reader. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Well, first, that's a great question, Amor. One no one's ever asked me, how do you these essays in A Beat Beyond, I am a slow writer. It's no surprise that this collects about 20 years. Right. And you're right, even though a lot didn't make it in here, many of these, whether the reviews, I begged editors, always begged them for more, like, please give me an extension, I'll give it to you in like a week or something like that. And I'm embarrassed to say I missed out on several writing opportunities this past year, mainly because my pitch of contemplativeness around a topic normally takes me probably maybe 3 or 4 times longer than it takes to write a poem. A poem, I can generate inspiration hits, right? And I set myself up more frequently. As a writer, to receive poetry and imagery and the transformation of experience or moment into these digestible 1-page, 2-page poems. But the essays take a while, and that's where I am, let's say I'm giving a talk at Bennington. I get the assignment probably in July, and I have to give the lecture, a 45-minute lecture in January. I need all 6 months. I need all of those days. I need all of those hours. And with many of these essays, thank God for the phone, I have, take notes to myself, send emails to myself, piece them all together, and I'm building on my argument. Like I remember the notes, I come back to the notes and then test them or challenge them, go out and find the poems that are going to support the essay. Or in the case with Cullen, I read a lot of Cullen's literature. And academia, this is why we're here, pays us to do that, pays us to kind of exist in our minds, to read and bring not what our age demand. You said, where did it go? Well, it went to micro essays, prose poems, digestible content for social media feeds, 15-minute ads, 30, our attention. And so this is the work that we do, is that we kind of sit and exist. I love long form essays. I love lectures. As someone mentioned recently, I did a reading around this book about book reviews. It's like you wince because every word is hard earned, and then the editor comes along and it's just like cut. And you're like, yeah, which has me love these particular moments because I can stretch it out. And if anything that I'm grateful for is that there is a relationship between the prose and writing of the poems, not just in content and themes, but the longer lectures, not only do they give me insight into the art, but they also train me to kind of sit longer. If we're talking about sitting and the Buddhist practice of Zazen, I'm sitting at my desk as a kind of contemplative practice.
And so that's the thinking part, but also the feeling part that goes along with that. Because I think, and you've mentioned this a couple of times already, but one of the things that really struck me looking back through this work and looking at your other work was how much your work is about listening. Right. And then maybe neck and neck with seeing, right? Like these kinds of practices that you're trying to do for yourself, but also trying to get others to do, right? Mm-hmm. Others to recognize about the importance of it, the value of it, like the gifts of it. And so I guess my question that I have is then maybe this is well-trod ground already, but how do you see and understand the sensory implications of your work, right? Wow. Or impulses, however you want to look at it, right? But I'm thinking about how you engage senses. And again, back to those young moments at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and just seeing, watching, listening, all of these tied up with contemplation and feeling. And so I'm wondering, is there something that you've learned about the senses in your work?
Mm-hmm. And maybe we should ask questions I'm so grateful for this question. The sensorium is the doorway, and the doorway into language, because we're put in that kind of Adamic space of having to find language to describe what our body is experiencing in the world. There's memory, there's language, there's things that people do that either excite us or hurt us, that may send us to the page. But I think the poem happens as soon as we walk out the door. or as soon as our eyes open and listening. Well, thank you for mentioning the Philadelphia Museum of Art, because it's there in which I realized how much of my seeing was somewhat bereft. I just marvel at visual artists' ability to kind of do more than capture, but also to kind of place us in the moment of creation. Music also was important as part of my education, and what I'm trying to do here at Vanderbilt in my newfound role as director is put the emphasis that we have to put ourselves in the line of experiences that are going to activate us into writing. So, and a lot of that is experiencing art. For me, recently in the past, as you know, I lived in Vermont for almost 2 decades. Being in natural spaces has also sensitized me, or kept my senses aware of the air and the environment and how I'm breathing and the quality of light certain times of the year during the seasons. So I think there's a strong argument to be made about our growth as writers and how we cultivate our own personal sensorium to kind of receive the world around us and to put that into poems and essays and fiction.
And that's that reciprocal relationship there.
Yeah,
I think
that's
too,
right.
right? You're bringing in the senses, transmitting something of that sensorium out. Yeah, I was kind of curious about that because, again, prepping for, trying to figure out questions and, not have it be
You're
this.
a terrific interlocutor.
Oh, thank you. But we can roll. We can roll.
Yes, we could.
Roll over, roll away. So I was like, okay, I gotta let me see. And so just looking back for patterns, and it didn't surprise me because I've known your work for so long, and I hadn't thought about the Vermont connection there, and how much that has impacted you as a writer, right? Just what you've been able to be around and to experience. So that was something that, I mean, you can see it. It's like when we were talking about poetry and music. Well, sure, right? I mean that like, okay, well, we're going to take this somewhere, right? And so that's why, just even thinking about listening, seeing, all of these things, it makes sense that we bring it and that we take it from the work. But just to think about, again, how you understand that is really fascinating to get a little glimpse into. Let's see. Okay, I'm just checking the time. So more process poems, and I'm kind of now I'm trying to get you to give away all your secrets, I think, for the master class in writing here. And this is just something that I have always been interested in, and how folks do this. And I know that for a while, and I think you're still doing it, you would definitely try to write and publish poems in different kinds of established forms, right? And doing the research and going back and finding, established but maybe lesser written, lesser known forms. So obviously you read those, right? You read poems from a certain kind of a formal tradition. But how do you get into the mindset of writing in these different forms that you have chosen to engage in? Right. Is it just, I could have answered my own question. Is it just reading? Or is there something that you feel like you have to do in order to get yourself into the space of a new expression?
You really want the secrets, don't you?
So,
yeah. Let's see, process. Lately, the walking has been, it's such a cliche to talk about the poets and their walking. That's, and maybe because normally I'm walking alone, and I think that's the condition that's created, that's the sense of kind of solitude and hearing I've learned not everyone hears themselves thinking. I've learned that. I've learned people actually react to what they hear from others rather than listening to self. And that could be something that's cultivated, I don't know, over the years of writing. And thank you for that. Thank you for this question. Getting into that space has meant, interestingly enough, and more me also finding different ways to do it. I often talk about like the third book, Holding Company. I listen to jazz pianists every morning, this one particular album, this 10-minute song every day for 9 months while writing that book every morning. And it was something about the driving rhythm of this particular song that pushed my blood. I mean, I could feel my blood racing through my veins. My breathing changed. And once I was there, it was like a zing, like someone turned up the volume in my body and I was ready to kind of write poetry. Walking, listening to music. I'm biking a lot lately. That's also allowing me to hear myself a little bit more. Yeah, in terms of essays, that is a lot of reading, and a lot of pulling together, as you know, pulling together all the disparate notes. And to my surprise, the ordering of paragraphs, shifting things around during the editing process, I deeply appreciate and value those moments rather than the moments of when I have to like trudge sentence after sentence, sentence after sentence.
Yeah, it doesn't get easier. Does it? Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Again, yeah, I'm taking the opportunity here to say these are things that I want to know about. So, we haven't gotten a chance to talk about them. So let's chop it up. So we are kind of
I wonder if there's any questions from the audience. I'm not keeping my eye on that yet.
no, not
No?
yet.
Okay.
Nope.
Cool.
So if anybody has any questions, please drop them in the Q&A. So again, a lot of your work, as you'd mentioned a couple of times already, is about freedom. And we were talking about empathy, and I get, people who are very much aware and trying, being kind and trying to, see if we're okay in these perilous times, which is a phrase that I've been hearing more and more. I was just wondering if you have a sense, because so much of your work also is about why poetry matters, right? And even though we get a little fatigued with having to always say why poetry matters, right? It's the perennial question that we have to approach and then kind of knock it aside a little bit. But so I'm just kind of curious about what you think the stakes of poetry or artistry are at this particular moment.
Yeah, I think this is kind of taken up in one of the essays in here, Best American Poetry, where I talk about almost a necessity of us acknowledging the political valence of American poetry, which has always been there before the Black arts, before Adrienne Rich. We had a terrific kind of labor movement here, of which poetry was important. I'm thinking about the political dimensions of the work of maybe a Charles Reznikoff, for example. I'm thinking about George Horton and all those abolitionist poets. There's always been that, and I'm waiting for the moment in which we can celebrate that, in which it doesn't have to be necessarily political, capital P, but there's always been some element. The mere writing in America, this is something I've come to realize by befriending poets and writers in other countries. Just the freedom to write what we want is something that we take for granted, which is itself political in another context. There are as you know, there's that, but I'm also thinking about in this book, the history of poets like Robert Hayden, for example, who kind of cast put a historical aesthetic, how can I put this? Made the historical poem a key linchpin of his work. And I believe a number of poets in America have done that. Some of them have won Pulitzer Prize. It would be interesting to look at the Pulitzer Prize and how many of those books have to do with the historicizing of America's struggle. We still have that going, and it's a good thing.
Yeah.
We just need to celebrate it and not pretend that, not deny that the agency that language and poetry affords us. I see there's a question.
Yeah, we got actually a couple of questions. Here. The first one is asking about the jazz piece that you were listening to, the jazz pianist that you were listening to over and over again, although it might be private since you didn't say. So I think, they're very, the questioner is very, very kindly giving you an out, but
well, he's no longer with us, I'll say that. If you Google jazz pianist live at the Montreal Jazz Festival, you'll figure out who it is. He's terrific, and it's the very first song.
So you can't, so your puzzles. Your puzzles don't stop with your poetry, right? So you're like,
actually, I shouldn't do that. It's Amor Jamal. It's Amor Jamal. It's a terrific song. I mean, the thing is, I don't want to be judged by my taste in music, actually.
Well,
it's a great album. My friend Jess Rao turned me on to it. I'm so grateful because it helped me hear, going back to hearing, it helped me hear that book a little bit more.
Yeah. Okay. It's another question that says, you've discussed the sensory influence of your work. After mentioning the zazen of writing, how has religion influenced your work?
Wow. I grew up, I went to Catholic school, and I grew up in the church. I even dabbled in other Christian sects of Christianity, and have a meditation practice as well. So I'm kind of syncretic, let's put it that way. The influence is, it allows me not to be, maybe writing this book of essays too, allows me not to be solipsistic, to realize as part of my growth as a writer, I think the lyric voice, and I think writing in solitude is really important, but I also believe that there are higher purposes of the art, and at the other end is a kind of is a potential, someone's out there who needs to hear what we have to say to each other. We have to hear what we have to say to each other. And I think faith has made me so aware of that. Not only that, growing up in a Pentecostal Baptist church, those rhythms just got in me. And you could probably hear some of that in the early poems.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question has come in, and it kind of connects, I think, to what you were just ending with. For Americans without a college degree or who hardly read at all, is there nonetheless poetry in their lives? And if so, how does it operate?
Wow. Yes, there's a lot of poetry. I mean, folks who are unsullied by academies, for example, often have some of the richest experiences with, let me not over romanticize that, but the speech patterns alone in our cultures is the poetry that we hear on a day-to-day basis. And everyone comes with some sort of relationship, formal, informal relationship to language through the songs we sing. That's poetry. Through the fairy tales, I throw it all in there. The cultural artifacts that is language, however it comes to us, organized as sound, is a certain kind of poetry. The myths, the folk tales, you name it. And then this is interesting. I strongly believe that there are experiences, if we are awakened to the world around us, we begin to see the non-language poetry. And that's the key to survival in my mind. I think being able to read certain moments as sublime, elegant, beautiful. Yeah, that's a great question.
It is. And it makes me also think about Aimé Césaire's essay, which is sometimes translated as Poetry and Knowledge, where Césaire is talking about and marveling at really the wonder and the terror that must have been, I'm paraphrasing obviously, that people must have felt when they first saw the sun rise, right? And that wonder and terror, of course, the sublimity of it, right? That just is central to poetry, to the poetic impulse, to the poetic drive. And I love that. I love that idea, because it does take us back to listening, seeing, contemplating, and thinking of the sacred and the human as what we always inhabit and what we always walk through. It just depends on whether we wish to see it or hear it or feel it. So
Amor, thank you so much.
Oh, Major, thank you. This was great. And here's our wonderful host back to take us out.
Thank you so much, Major and Amor, for such a wonderful conversation, and especially for that wonderful ending note. And thank all of you for joining us here tonight. A reminder that you can buy A Beat Beyond from Greenlight Bookstore and support Major's work, either in person at either of our Brooklyn locations or online. We ship anywhere within the US. And I am just going to paste that book buy link for you all in the chat one more time. And reminder that you get 10% off if you shop online with code Greenlight Events 10. Thank you all so much again for sharing this space with us tonight to talk about poetry and art, and have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And